Here are some Rust error handling best practices that have been working very well for me. First, I split error requirements into two categories: error for my test code and my examples, and the one for my production code, which includes my app, libs, and modules. Obviously, my test code, my unit test code, will be part as well as my apps and libs and modules. But I still make the distinction between the usage in both cases. So now, on the test code side, I want to be loose. I don't need to be very strict, and in fact, most of the time, pass-through will be plenty enough. Just pass through the things, and if I am in my unit test, I will have the function anyway to give me more context. Now, if I need a little bit more information, what I'm okay to use is static string, which is static str, or a formatted string, and that will be perfectly fine. Now, on the production code side, I want to be strict, and that means that I want to own the structure. I want to have the full control of what I capture and how I capture it. And there is a perfect type in Rust for that, which is enum. And enum is an algebraic type, which is a sum type, which allows us to have different types per variant. So it's a perfect fit. Now, one thing that I want in both cases is I want to be progressive. And what the progressive means here, it means that when I write code on my test side, I want to be able to move it or to copy paste it into my production side. I don't want to have one way of working on one side and another way on the other side, beside the type of the error. Then also what I would like to do is I would like to start perhaps a little bit loose at the beginning of the project and then go more strict as the project matures. And to do that, my strategy is to use most of the time the question mark pattern. Sometimes I might have a map error or OK or, but the goal here is to have the question mark at the end. So I'm not using unwrap, I'm not using expect, and I'm not using context from anyhow. And that is one of the reasons as well that I'm not using anyhow on my test code anymore. So what I like to do is I normalize all my code, which is my test code, or my production code, or the beginning of my production code, with a question mark. And that allows me to be progressive and to use the same coding style for both sides. So now, on the code side, what pattern I'm following is a my module error. So I'm not, for example, giving the full descriptive name inside the error enum, because that will be redundant. And actually, the Rust ecosystem right now is more or less normalizing into this pattern anyway, which I think is actually better. So if I am within my module, usually I just import error and I'm good. And if I am another module and I want to disambiguate, then I will import my module, and then I will do a my module : error. And then one thing also that I'm not doing is I don't have the error within an error submodule, because that would be redundant. And again, the Rust community right now is more or less normalizing on this pattern, which is actually the best of both worlds. Now, on the result side, as a best practice, I have the sibling of the error, which will be my result. That will be a type alias of t. I let t to be as open as possible, but I lock this result type alias that is within this module with the corresponding error. That is the trick. So I know when I'm using result of this module, I have no choice but to use this error. Okay, so now let's drill one level down. So first here in both cases, most of the time, I have a type alias result t, like this one. This could be std, I use core if one day I want to do embedding coding. And then I have my result that I have on type t, which is completely open. Yes, I don't have any trade bound here. And then I have the error. And then the error will be in the same file. So the error, in the case of a test code, I use now boxed in the standard error. And that is actually as flexible almost as anyhow, since string and static str can into a boxed in error. And most of the other type are also passed through. The benefit here is that this is completely lib-free and is progressive now because I'm going to use the same pattern in my test code that in my production code. And in my production code, what I use is the enum. And at the high level, I have two types of variants. The ones that are usually passed through, And those I'm using derive more rather than this error, because derive more allows me to use the from without using the display. So I can have my own display for my error, but I can still have the benefit of the from. So that gives me the transparent in this error, and that will work very nicely. And then for my errors, the one that I want to have full control of, I use a variant name as well, as descriptive as possible. And then as content, I typically go with variant struct to be extremely clear about the members, especially when there's more than one, of the possible values. So one thing that I could have done here, for example, is having a tuple like that. But that, in my book, this is an anti-pattern, because now I capture the data, but I don't have the meaning of the data. Now, one argument could be to say, well, we could give a display with this error or derive more. That is a way to do it with derive more. But that doesn't solve the issue, because the structure is still very ambiguous. And now we're capturing the meaning in text, which is good for the user, bad for the program. So this is why I typically always, when there's more than one and it's not very obvious, I tend to use the variant struct and give clear names. And in fact, for web app and even desktop app with Story, for example, I don't need a display, because typically, for example, for a Rust backend web app, for the server error, I will probably serialize them in JSON, such as I can store them at new line JSON in some logs. And even in the Story app, I will serialize them probably in JSON and then stream them into the client, the one that I want to pass through to the client, and then I will render them there. So typically what I do, and we're going to see that later in the code, but for most of my apps, except simple command lines, I typically implement the display for the error, which is a requirement to be able to be error, but I use just the debug. And that will give me enough information. Because in fact, the people that are going to read that in a web app or in a desktop app are not going to be the end user, but either the developer or the DevOps. So it's going to be geek people, and geek people do not care about English. We care about clarity. And that is super clear. So now let's go and see how it works in some real code. So first, what I have most of the time, if it's not all, is derive more. And I use a beta version. It's pretty old, but very robust. And the first feature that I use is a from. So that will allow me to have the derive from. If I want to use a display, I can do it like this, and that's fine. But again, most of the time, actually, I don't use display for my errors, except if I do a end user command line. So now, let's see in our main.rs. And I'm going to start it as if I were in our examples or test files. And because everything is progressive, then we can progressively structure it to a production code pattern. So it's going to be pretty cool. So typically when I start a new project, I toggle my terminal and I'm going to do a cargo watch run. And that is my alias that I'm going to display. And that will run my hello world. So this is my starting point. Then at the beginning of my test or my examples, or the very beginning of my project, I'm going to import my boxed-in types. So again, I have my result t, which is my core result of my error. And now the error for now is a type error, is a type alias on the boxed-in standard error. And that would give me a lot of flexibility. And so usually what I do is I have any function I have, my test or whatever. And if they don't need to return anything, I do something like that. And that will allow me now to put question mark in all of the functions that needs to have so. Now, just for the sake of the example, let's say that we have a function, and I'm just going to copy it here, which is going to list all of the files for a given path. And now we can return our result, which is this one, result of t, and that will return a vector string. Now, all of that is kind of the magic to have the list of direct files, the files only, and only the one that have a valid UTF-8 file name. That is what we're doing in the latest filter map. It doesn't really matter. The point is that we're reading the file system. Here we're doing a question mark, and it works because that will be a standard IO error, which will work with our into boxed-in. That works perfectly fine. And then we can have our OK files at the end. If we press save, that should compile nicely. And now we can do something like that, where we can do a let files, list files, the current folder, and now we can just print that in a nice way. So if we press save, toggle our terminal, then we have our little answer over there. So that works pretty nice. And it's nice now because we don't have to worry about what we're using. Everything is passing through. We can toggle this off. Now, the cool thing of this approach is that not only is a pass-through, but we can also have custom errors in the shape of static string or formatted string. So for example, let's say that somehow I didn't want to pass through this error, but I wanted to say map error, and I will take the error from the IO, and then I could say a string, for example, that will do error while reading dir. And now I can do question mark, and that will work completely fine. So here I could obviously put something like that. Or if I wanted, I could format a string like so with my error. And that will work as well because both static string and string can do an into standard error. So everything is working nicely. So typically I don't need to do that in my test, in my examples, or early in my code, so I just use a pass-through. But now similarly, what we can do is, if in my logic I had some custom errors, I could do a if files is empty, and I will do a return error cannot list empty folder. That will be silly, obviously, but still. And now the trick is because we are not using question mark, we just do a into, which is equivalent, and now everything works fine. Everything compiles. So if I toggle the terminal, everything looks good. So now when I work in a real project, typically what I will do is I will take, for example, this one, and I will create probably a mod fs for file system, for my own file system libraries. I might put it in mod. Then I will put the function there. And now I will do a use create result. Now I'm using the create result. I don't need to know that it's just a type alias on a silly error boxed in, but now everything is working nicely. I don't forget to put that public. And then I go back to my main, and I'm going to import that. And typically what I do, put it below like that. It works better after. So that's it. So that is pretty clean. I have my mod, I have my create error, and eventually here I might have my own error as well. But for now, I decided that my fs error are going to use my create error, which is fine. So if we step back here, the nice things again is I am in this level here where I can start my code like this for my test, or I can start my code for my production code in a relatively loose way. And now we're going back up this way to become more and more strict and structured. So on the production side, typically what I do is I put that in a mod error. And then to keep the signature the same, I'm going to do a re-export over here. So in this case, I'm going to re-export the self error and then the error and the result. And so now the only thing I need to do is I need to create these files. That is always a single file. And then I go there and then I copy these guys. If I want to be very simple, press save and everything compiles as before. But the good news here is that all of this code and everything doesn't have to know anything, and everything works well with a question mark. And then the only thing I need to change is what is in the error.rs. And then if I decide that my fs module should have errors, I will create it over there, and then everything will be fine. So then my next step to become a little bit more structured is I'm going to remove these two lines, and this one is going to come back actually, but I'm removing them for now. And I have a little Rust 10x VS Code extension with some snippets, and then can do error like that. And now I have a bunch of snippets, and the one that I like to take to be flexible is the third one with a custom. So I'm going to import this one, and that is what I'm going to get. So I still have my pub result of t exactly as before. I'm going to use the derive more from. And again, at the beginning, usually I don't use display. If I were going to use display, I could do it like that, and then we'll make sure to add the feature in my cargo to ML. But for now, most of the case, I do like that. And then in my error, so this is kind of a template, I have my custom of string. So that would give us a lot of flexibility. In fact, if I press save, everything should compile because we have the from string. And also I have a code section over there that gives us a from str, and even a custom function that takes anything that implements the display. So this way, I'm relatively flexible because I can give anything that looks like a string, and that will go into the custom. And then eventually, I will remove that. And then I organize my code, and one of my best practices is to have a section for the externals, and my code template just gives one example where I do the from, like this error, transparent. So I can do a from like that, and then I say this is the IO error, and then I put it like that. And then that's it. And luckily here, because my example was also with file IO, then everything compiles nicely. But obviously you might want to delete that and have your own external whatever. And then down there, I have the error boilerplate, and that is where I implement the display trait for my error, which is a requirement to be able to be an error. Then I just use the debug print. And that is again plain enough because my strategy is to be very descriptive in my enums, so everything will be very clear, and I don't need English for web app or desktop apps because English will come from another part of the system. And then at the bottom, obviously, we have the implementation, such as we can do the question mark. So I don't really mind to add that all the time. It's part of my snippets anyway. That gives me flexibility, the custom. And then eventually I will remove those. So again, if I press save, it works. And if I toggle the terminal, everything works as before. I can press save again, and everything is nice and neat. So if we step back again, we started here, both sides. We actually have the production code really look like our test code and our example code. And then we went up a little bit on the structured. Now we have the custom. And now the next step that I typically do for real application or real production code is I'm going to remove the custom and the string because I want everything to have their right enum. So the way that I do it is I go to my error, and then I'm going to remove my custom, and I'm going to remove that section as well. Press save. Typically that will compile nicely, but then obviously I have this error here where I had my custom error over there, which now doesn't take string. So what I want to do is I actually want to go to my error, and I'm going to create an error. And typically what I do is, again, I put all of my external libs over there. And then in this case, typically I'm going to have the fs module. And so I organize them by module. So I'm going to have fs. And then in this case, I don't really need to capture more information. So I will just have an invariant, silly1, can't list, empty folder. The name doesn't really make sense at the beginning. I'm not trying to be too creative. I'm trying to be consistent. Sometimes, I'm not saying I do that all the time. I prefix them like that because eventually they might go to their own thing. But in this case, we can keep it like this and then paste it. I go there. And now on top, I'm going to say where I want to create result and error as well. And now I have my error and then the variant. And that will work fine. And I could do a map error over there if I wanted or whatever I wanted. So that is a way that now I have my error very strict. And sometime again, when that becomes a little bit too big or it doesn't really make sense, or I want to use fs in other places, then I'm going to move those into the fs error. And then I might wrap it there with something like that, where I will delete that. And then I will have fs error like that. And then I will have a from. And typically I put all my submodules, something like that. Like this, I keep the things, other stuff over there. So that is what I will do as the thing grows and as I decide to split out my errors. But for now, that is what we need. Press save, everything compile. We toggle the terminal, everything runs, and so far so good. And then, as I was saying before in the introduction, is if this is kind of a web app, web server, or even a Tori app, what I will typically do, not for all the errors, but the one that I want to send to the logs, for example, I will implement the serialize and make sure that everything implements serialize. And there's a cool crate which is serialize, something like that, that will help also a lot for the one that doesn't implement it. And then once I have that, I can serialize it to a new line JSON, send it to the server, do whatever I want, and everything's become very structured, very typed, and I have the control of it, and I don't have any text, but I have all the meanings. And then when I want to do a command line tool, then I will have again the display from the derived more, and then I will add whatever the display annotation is. And then that's it. And so that is what I use derive more and not this error, because I can cherry pick the one I want. And typically it's only the from and the display. I'm very happy with my display of my debugs. Now, as a last example here, if I go to my module, what I typically have is my test code below. So let's say that I want to create some test. And here again, I have my Rust NX snippets, so test module, that should be good. And I'm going to use the module 1 without the async. And then I have another one, test function. That should be the text function with my comments, setup, fixtures, and so on. But the point is that now what I do is within my test, which is a file, or within that, I have my type error boxed in and my result on this one. So this one, all of my tests have this result, very simple. And then if I want to use a parent, I can use it via super. So that is a way here where I'm going to import everything above, but in fact, I'm overriding error and result. So everything will work very nicely. So as we can see, I'm using the same pattern here that we used at the beginning of our main.rs. And then in my production code, which is this one, not the unit test, then I am much more structured over time. Okay, so with that, that will conclude this episode. Hope you liked it. Big thanks to Crab Nebula for their sponsorship. Patreon, any help is big help. Until next one, happy coding.